Hello and welcome, Randolph Township Library patrons. My name is Hillary. I'm from the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts located in Madison, New Jersey. Before we dive into today's program topic, I'm just going to talk briefly about our museum and our building shown here. So if you've ever been through Madison, you've probably seen this building at the corner of Main Street. You may have thought it was a church. And that impression would be reinforced if you were to go inside, where there's stained glass windows, vaulted arch ceilings, and many other things that make it feel very church-like. But this building was never a church. It was, in fact, Madison's first public library. It was built in 1899 by a man called D. Willis James as a gift to the town of Madison. And it was intentionally built to look like a church. This picture gives you a little bit of an idea of what the inside of the building looked like when it was a library. This is the main reading room, which is where you would read your books. In the earliest days of the library, you were not allowed to just browse the shelves. You would tell the librarian what book you wanted, and they would get it for you from the book stacks, which you can see part of at the very back of this picture. They would bring you the book in the reading room, and that's where you would read it. The lights on those tables are electric. This building did have electricity from the time it was built, so a pretty modern building for its day. Another innovation that it had a lower level where they stocked magazines and newspapers and other periodicals in many different languages. Madison was a growing town and had many immigrants moving in who spoke a wide range of languages. And many of these people would be at work until the main library closed. So that lower level periodicals room would remain open even after the main library closed, so people could go in, read the newspaper in their own language after work. So this remained the library until the mid-1960s, at which point the building became too small to house the library for this growing town, and the library moved to its current location. And there was a couple in town who had been collecting objects and tools and other artifacts from the 18th and 19th century. They asked if they could use this building as a museum for their objects. The town of Madison said yes, and the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts was born in 1969. So this shows you what the building looks like today. And it gives you a little bit better sense of some of the decorative elements on the inside. We are now looking back toward that reading room, so sort of from the opposite angle of that previous picture. That room now houses our changing exhibits. About twice a year we change out exhibits there, and we have other exhibits throughout the museum as well. Many things have changed about the museum in 50 years, but we are still dedicated to telling the story of everyday New Jerseyans from 18th and 19th century and to helping people connect with that history. So turning now to the topic of today's program, the ABCs of candy. So we're going to be looking at the history of various types of sweets, focusing on chocolate bars, but looking at some other types of candy and sweets as well. We're going to be looking at some overall history and then at the history of some specific candies as well. And some of these have been around for quite a while and some are quite new, and we'll see some other trends as well as we go along. So let's start by taking a look at some of the general history of chocolate bars. So the chocolate bar as we think of it today is a relatively new phenomenon. Chocolate, of course, has been around for much longer. The Mayans were drinking chocolate thousands of years ago, and this is the form of chocolate that first made its way into European and then American culture. This was a liquid drink chocolate, somewhat similar to our hot chocolate today, but probably richer, a lot less sweet, and more likely to have spices in it for flavoring. So similar but not identical type of drink. So the chocolate bar that we think of today didn't come out until the mid-19th century when someone finally figured out how to press cocoa into a bar. So Stephen Fry does this in 1847 and definitely making use of some new machinery and technologies that didn't really exist before this. You may not have heard the name Joseph Fry, although he was an important chocolate bar maker in those early years. But you've probably heard the name Cadbury. And John Cadbury was right behind Fry with his first chocolate bar in 1849. Fry and Cadbury were both working in the United Kingdom in Great Britain. And in 1866, Fry released sort of the first mass-produced chocolate bar, his Fry's Chocolate Cream, a fondant center surrounded by chocolate. Now, an important thing to note about these early chocolate bars by Fry and Cadbury is that this chocolate is closer to what we would think of as bittersweet chocolate today. Definitely nowhere near as sweet as most of the chocolate you can buy now. It was also most definitely dark chocolate. Milk chocolate had to come along a little bit later. But that did happen. For those of you who are milk chocolate fans, you'll be happy to know that in 1875, the first successful milk chocolate bar was made. So Daniel Peter had been trying to make milk chocolate before this, but he couldn't figure out how to keep mildew from forming on his chocolate. So he teamed up with Henry Nestle. So the name you're probably familiar with, you probably think of more in the context of chocolate, but originally he made powdered baby milk. So who better than to help keep milk from going bad when added to chocolate than someone who's already making powdered milk. So those milk chocolate bars come out in 1875, but still chocolate doesn't take off. It takes various other factors and time before it really becomes popular. And one of those factors was World War I. So chocolate manufacturers were asked to produce these giant blocks of chocolate to be sent to the troops. It was sort of a quick and easy source of calories and energy. Those soldiers came home, they developed a taste for this chocolate and wanted it when they got home. So that demand was greatly increased. And as many as 40,000 candy bars appeared in the decades following World War I. So that's when we start to see many of the candy bars that still exist today, and certainly that concept of candy bars and chocolate bars that we think of started around that time. So before we turn to some specific candies and chocolates, we have to talk about sweeteners because we cannot talk about sweets without discussing what makes them sweet, the reason that we love them so much. So today, sugar is certainly our primary sweetener. We, of course, have other artificial sweeteners and other things we use as well, but sugar is definitely our key sweetener. But in the 19th century, sugar was expensive. It had to be imported. It was just not as readily available as it is today. Now, a note about that tool that's at the bottom of the screen there, those are called sugar tongs, because sugar came in cones like you see in the picture on the left. So the sugar tongs would be used to cut off small pieces to go in lumps like those you see there, or to help grind it up to go into whatever you were making. But certainly there was not as much sugar around as there is today. So another option that did exist was molasses. A little bit cheaper than sugar, but does still have to be imported. So still not the cheapest or most efficient option for a sweetener. Also, both molasses and sugar were primarily coming from the Caribbean and were produced by enslaved people, their labor. So a number of abolitionists would boycott molasses and sugar in the 19th century as a protest against slavery. They would turn instead to what they saw as the moral alternative of sweetener, things that could be found right here in New Jersey. So what would that be? We have two options we're going to talk about. The first of them, honey. Still a sweetener we use today, comes of course from bees, but something that was much more readily available to your average person in the 19th century, so that was a very common sweetener. You also had maple sugar. A little bit harder to produce than honey, but this is still something that people were making, and in the wintertime, many maple trees would be tapped for their sap. You can see in this picture sort of the various stages of this production, from getting the sap out of the tree to boiling it down to being the way that you need it. So this picture here shows some of the tools involved in maple sugaring. The auger on the right is used to drill the hole into the tree. On the left, you can see the spout that's put into the tree dripping slowly out the sap. Because the sap does not run out quickly. It drips out. It takes a really long time to fill up a bucket of sap. And it takes 40 gallons of sap to create 1 gallon of syrup, and even more than that to create the actual sugar. So you need an awful lot of sap from your maple trees to make very much sugar. But this was a way you could sweeten things with things you could find right here in New Jersey. Okay, so now it's time to look at some specific treats and their origins. So we'll be going through, as I said, alphabetically, and see if you can think of what these might be as we go along. So A, you can think about what might be our A candy. How about Almond Joy? Sort of the counterpart to Mounds. Almond Joy was created in 1948 by Peter Paul Halagian of the Peter Paul Candy Company. Previously, he had focused on Mounds because there were sort of coconut and sugar shortages, so focusing it on one particular candy. But after the war, develops the Almond Joy, which is really just Mounds with the nuts. The 1970s jingle is one of the more well-known advertisements for the Almond Joy and the Mounds together. Sometimes you feel like a nut, sometimes you don't. Almond Joy got nuts, Mounds don't, so kind of a marketing campaign of the two products side by side. So Peter Paul Candy Company did merge with Cadbury in 1978. Remember, I was saying how companies merged over the century. And then the US portion of Cadbury was actually bought by Hershey in 1988. So Almond Joy and Mounds do fall under the Hershey umbrella today. So B, there's quite a few B candies, but any thoughts on where we might be going with this? How about Baby Ruth? A nice distinctive one. So it was created in 1921. You would probably think that it was named for baseball player Babe Ruth. It certainly came out at the time when he was at the height of his fame. It has the red, white, and blue colors. Seems probable. But in fact, the Curtis Candy Company, who made Baby Ruth, claimed that they instead had named it for Grover Cleveland's long deceased daughter, Ruth. She died in 1904, so it was not a recent death, but that was their claim. Seems probable that they were trying to capitalize on Babe Ruth's name and fame without having to pay an endorsement deal. However, it gets even more interesting. So in 1926, Babe Ruth tried to name a candy bar after himself, and the Curtis Candy Company sued him. They claimed that they had not been using his name, they had named it after Grover Cleveland's daughter, but that now Babe Ruth was trying to take advantage of the success of the Baby Ruth candy bar, and that that was not okay. And they won their suit. Babe Ruth was not allowed to name a candy bar after himself. How about D? For this, we're going to go off of our chocolate bar and go into more of the candy realm a little bit. Look at dots. So these are a gumdrop going back to 1945. So they are made by Tootsie Roll, who does claim that they're the #1 selling gumdrop in America. Not sure if the claim is 100% true, but certainly 4 billion dots are produced a year. So they are certainly consumed in quite a large quantity. They are apparently vegan, also gluten-free, nut-free, peanut-free, and kosher. So pretty much can be consumed by any dietary restrictions except for those who can't have sugar. How about H? Hershey bar is really the only thing H can possibly stand for with chocolate, right? So this is a classic created in 1900. And as we saw way back, it was not the first milk chocolate bar, but it really became the first truly mass-produced and widely available chocolate. And part of that is because of a couple clever things that Milton Hershey did. He made his chocolate cheaper, so it was able to be bought by more Americans. He also sort of take it around to people who might never have eaten chocolate before, giving samples. And he made sure that it was sold in all stores, not just candy stores. Today we take that for granted, right? Any grocery store, any pharmacy, anything like that, you're likely to find candy, often at the register. But that would not have been the case. Chocolates, candies were sold at candy stores. But he made sure that it could be part of your just regular food purchases, which greatly increased its availability to the average American. I Well, I went here with one of my favorite sweet treats. Not a candy for sure, but ice cream. Something very popular for sure, and something that has been around for a really long time. Probably over 2,000 years. It seems to date back to Persia. So ice cream is certainly not a new thing, but it really only took off in the late 19th, early 20th century. Some of that has to do with, of course, storage of ice cream and other things as well. And this picture here shows an ice cream mold. You can see the shape of the leaf that was used by Days Ice Cream, which was started in Morristown and then went down to Ocean Grove. But when you'd get your ice cream from them, there would be all these different shapes and molds that you could have it in. So you would get your ice cream served in a shape like this. Pretty cool. Now, another fun tidbit about Day's Ice Cream, which was founded by the Day brothers. One of the people who did an apprenticeship there, you may have heard of him, was a Milton Hershey. That's where he did his first apprenticeship. All right, how about K? So really only one choice here also, the Kit Kat bar, right? And this has probably the most unusual origin for its name. So it goes back to 17th century London. It was a literary club who met at a pie shop owned by a man called Christopher Catling. And a common nickname for Christopher is Kit. So the nickname for this club was the Kit Kat Club. The mutton pies that could be purchased there were also called Kit Kat pies. And for some reason, which is unknown, Roundtree decided to draw on this name when they were rebranding their chocolate crisp in 1937. So not clear why they drew on this, but they did, and it's certainly a very catchy name that you're not likely to forget. L. How about the Lifesavers? So another candy, not so much chocolate. And in fact, that was one of its successes. So as popular and wonderful as chocolate might be, before air conditioning and refrigeration were common, chocolate was not very practical in the summer. It just didn't last. So something like the Lifesaver was much more useful, much more practical in the summer. It was named because it looked like a flotation device, and it apparently was quite popular, enough so that during World War II, other candy manufacturers donated their sugar rations to the Lifesaver Company to make sure that the troops could have enough lifesavers. It was apparently considered important enough for the troops to have that. You can see the 1917 ad over on the side there, the little girl sort of holding the candy like you would hold a lifesaver flotation device. Now, one other thing about this, and this is not something that I have been able to document or prove in any way, but speculatively. This came out in 1912, sort of the later part of the year probably. In April of 1912 was the Titanic, one of the biggest maritime disasters, and a disaster in which flotation devices figured prominently in the conversations. So it seems to me possible that there was a little bit of a coincidence between a candy called a Lifesaver coming out so soon after the Titanic, although that is not something that I can in any way prove. So a classic M candy has to be the M&Ms. They come in all different flavors and sizes and shapes and everything today and have been around a while. That distinctive candy coating, the melt in your mouth, not in your hand, certainly part of its original intended design, something else again to help combat chocolate melting in the summertime. It was created as a merger between Bruce Murray of Hershey and Forrest Mars of the Mars Company, two major chocolate manufacturers at the start of World War II. So these two joined forces, combining their sugar and chocolate rations, their machinery, and the fact that Murray had a contract to create the chocolate for the ration pack for the American soldiers. And they did create these M&Ms to serve that purpose. Now, after the war, Mars did maneuver Murray out of this partnership. It's unclear exactly how this worked, and there's different stories about that, but certainly they became major competitors and have remained that ever since. And yet, the M&M name, which didn't appear, in fact, on the candies until the 1950s, immortalizes this partnership of these two major candy companies that are now major competitors. They remained popular enough that they were the candy taken up on the Space Shuttle Columbia in 1981. Another interesting tidbit, in E.T., it was originally supposed to be M&Ms, but they turned this down. And so Reese's Pieces got to be included in that movie instead. I imagine the Mars Company might have a little regret over that decision. So N could be for Necco wafers. Not the most popular candy, but an important one to include here. So this was invented in 1847 by English immigrant Oliver Chase, who invented a lozenge cutting machine to be able to make those round shapes. So popular legend says that during the Civil War, Union soldiers enjoyed carrying these to eat and called them hub wafers. Certainly the name Necco wafer did not come about until 1912, and it simply came from the name of the candy company that made them. The New England Confectionery Company made them at the time. So while these may not be everybody's favorite candy, they were beloved by Admiral Richard Byrd. When he went to Antarctica in 1928, he took along 2.5 tons of Necco wafers. He evidently felt that this was something he could not live without in his long expedition. Now, Necco, as a company, went bankrupt in 2018, but good news for any Necco wafer fans, they are apparently back in production as of, I believe, May of 2020. Are, well, really only one classic option there, right? The Reese's Peanut Butter Cup. So what a classic taste, right? That peanut butter wrapped in chocolate. It's a favorite of many people. It comes in different sizes and styles and shapes for different times of year and all of that. Now, this one was first created in 1922 by H.B. Reese, who actually had been a Hershey employee, sort of struck out on his own and made this delicious candy. Ironically, it's come full circle, and Hershey then bought the company back in the 1960s, so it's still now under the Hershey umbrella. How about S? Another classic, the Snicker bar, right? Goes back to 1930, one of the earliest ones made by Mars, the Mars Candy Company. It was named after a horse that the family owned. Now, this was an expensive candy at the time. People expected candy to cost maybe a nickel, and it cost 20 cents. It was expensive, kind of a premium from the beginning. And it has been, nonetheless, a top seller since it was introduced almost 100 years ago. T, well, to think of slightly creatively to get this candy to be beginning with T, but it's another classic, the Three Musketeers, right? Another one of those early candies made by the Mars Company, 1932. And it was named this because it had vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry originally, not just the chocolate. The other two were dropped, but the highly distinctive and memorable name remained. They definitely had a knack for naming the Mars family. Milky Way was the name of a family farm, so they definitely had some very catchy and memorable names. So W could also be for Whitman's sampler. Certainly not the first candy we'd all think of in terms of quality of the chocolate, but if you're looking for an easy to find and inexpensive box of chocolates, it's certainly a good bet. And the Whitman's company goes way back to the 1840s, not making chocolates yet, but it was a candy company. And then it started making its distinctive Whitman's chocolate sampler in 1912. And it's interesting more for some of the innovations it made than for the chocolate itself. So it was one of the first chocolate companies to put in a list of what the different chocolates were in the box. So even today, that's not a universal thing, but certainly at that point, this was quite innovative. And isn't it nicer to know what chocolate you're grabbing than to grab by chance and hope it's the one you want? Well, they sort of pioneered that idea. They also were the first candy company to use cellophane to wrap the boxes, which was important as chocolates and candies started to be shipped further afield. They also teamed up with GE in 1946 to develop a refrigerated display case. At a time when air conditioning was still very rare, this was an important move toward making it easier to display and therefore sell chocolate even in the summer. So very interesting and innovative company, even if they're not the highest quality of chocolate by itself. So X takes a little bit of out of the box thinking. So imagine you're writing a letter and you sign it XO, 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 hugs and kisses, right? And the X is for the kiss. So what about Hershey's Kiss for X? Very popular candy, one of the top selling in the US. Now this goes back to 1907, which is coincidentally the same year that Dairy Church, Pennsylvania became Hershey, Pennsylvania. There's a popular idea that the name for this chocolate came from the sound the machine made when it dropped the chocolate onto the belt, sort of that sucking sound. That's not actually the case. The term of a kiss for a confection actually goes back much further. As early as the 1820s, it was used to apply to any sort of candy wrapped with a twist, not even necessarily chocolate. And by the 1850s, it was understood to mean basically a small confection. So Hershey was simply using an existing term for their version of it, not inventing a new term. And it wasn't until the 1990s that they were able to trademark the term Hershey's Kiss. And that only with difficulty, because prior to that, it had been felt that this was a name that could apply to many different candies, not just theirs. They were able to trademark the tissue paper flag earlier. That goes back to 1924. And they were wrapped in foil from the beginning and colored foil starting in 1962. But this is certainly one of the most common and popular candies in the US. So why? How about York peppermint patties? All that classic mint and chocolate taste, right? The sweetness of the inner part contrasted with the bitter chocolate around the outside. So a classic taste, but the York peppermint patty is a little bit different because it's crisper and it apparently has to pass a snap test to be able to leave the factory. And I remember as a kid holding them up to my ear and snapping them to get that sound. So these were originally made by Henry C. Kessler at a York Cone Company, but then that was bought by the Peter Paul Candy Company, who you may remember from way back, made the Almond Joys. And it was under Peter Paul that the 1970s Get the Sensation campaign took off and probably really popularized the York peppermint patties in a whole new way. So thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the origin of some candies that are familiar, some that are less familiar, and kind of appreciating the ready availability we have of any sweet or chocolate that we want. If I were in the same place as you, I would right now be passing out some chocolate samples because I know this makes everyone want to eat chocolate. And as I can't do this, I hope you're all able to enjoy your favorite candy bar soon in our honor. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out. My email is on the screen there. Any comments or anything, I would love to hear from you. Hope to see you in person before too long. Take care and stay safe.